There is a moment in every great power confrontation when the initiating party discovers that the action it took to project strength has instead revealed the precise coordinates of its vulnerability. The United States imposed a blockade of the Strait of Hormuz to demonstrate decisive military resolve. What the blockade has actually demonstrated with a clarity that no adversary could have engineered more effectively is exactly where American strategic power ends and Chinese strategic power begins. A Chinese-linked oil tanker, the Star Rich, passing through the Strait of Hormuz after the American blockade was imposed. Not stopped, not turned back, not boarded, passing through. Despite prior American sanctions on the vessel, despite the most powerful naval force in human history positioned in those waters to enforce American policy. One tanker. But understand what that one tanker represents. It is not a shipping story. It is a signal deliberately chosen, deliberately executed, and deliberately publicized that tells every government on earth watching this confrontation exactly what the American blockade of the world's most critical energy corridor is actually worth when China decides it is not going to comply. And simultaneously, Xi Jinping is in a series of high-level diplomatic engagements that, taken together, constitute the most significant Chinese diplomatic offensive since the beginning of the conflict. The UAE, Spain, Russia. 3 meetings that span the Gulf, Europe, and the Eurasian strategic axis. 3 meetings that together are constructing something, not just commentary on American policy, not just diplomatic positioning, something structural. Something that is being built to last beyond this crisis and to define the post-crisis order. Welcome to the Jiang Report. I am Professor Jiang Xueqin. Tonight, we are going to do what no mainstream analysis has yet attempted. Read China's moves in the Hormuz confrontation, not as reactive diplomatic commentary, but as the active construction of a new global order in real time. Explain exactly what the Star-Rich tanker passage means for American blockade enforcement. Map what Xi's 3 simultaneous diplomatic engagements are building toward. And answer the question that every honest strategic analyst must answer tonight. Has the United States just handed China the greatest strategic gift of the 21st century? Subscribe immediately. Share this now. What follows is the analysis that the situation actually demands. Here is tonight's architecture. First, the Star-Rich passage and what it reveals about blockade enforcement reality. A blockade that cannot be enforced against a sanctioned vessel linked to the world's 2nd largest economy is not a blockade. It is a declaration. We are going to explain the gap between those 2 things with the precision it demands. Second, Xi's diplomatic triangle, UAE, Spain, Russia. These 3 engagements are not random. They are the deliberate construction of a coalition architecture, Gulf energy, European legitimacy, Eurasian military weight, that together constitutes a challenge to American unilateralism that is broader and more durable than anything Washington anticipated when it imposed the blockade. We will map what is being built. Third, China's foreign ministry declaration and its intended audience. Beijing calling the American blockade dangerous and irresponsible is not diplomatic boilerplate. Every word of that formulation was chosen with precision for a specific audience. We will identify who that audience is and what China is asking them to do. Fourth, the energy economics of the blockade. The Strait of Hormuz is not a military problem that happens to have economic implications. It is an economic reality that military force cannot simply override. We will walk through exactly which economies are being damaged by the blockade and why the damage pattern creates political pressure that works against American strategic objectives. Fifth, where the U.S.-China confrontation over Hormuz goes from here. This is no longer a U.S.-Iran conflict with Chinese commentary on the margins. China has made itself a direct stakeholder in the resolution of the Hormuz question. We will assess what that means for every trajectory this conflict can now take. Let us begin with the Star-Rich, because the Star-Rich is the story inside the story that everyone else is missing. Prior American sanctions. That means the Star-Rich was already on a list, already designated, already the subject of the formal criminal, legal, and administrative architecture that American financial and maritime enforcement deploys to prevent vessels linked to sanctioned entities from operating freely in international commerce. The United States knew about this vessel, had taken formal action regarding this vessel, and then imposed a blockade of the waterway that this vessel subsequently transited, and the vessel passed through. Now, there are multiple possible explanations for this, and military analysts will debate the specifics. Perhaps the vessel's passage occurred in a gap in naval coverage. Perhaps the enforcement decision was made at a level of command that did not want to create a direct U.S.-China naval incident over a single tanker. Perhaps the rules of engagement for the blockade contain carve-outs or thresholds that a single commercial vessel does not meet. All of these explanations may contain elements of truth, but here is what none of those explanations change. The image that the world observed was a Chinese-linked sanctioned tanker moving through an American blockade. The perception in the capitals of every country watching this confrontation is that the blockade has a limit, that the limit is China, and that China has just demonstrated it publicly, deliberately, and without suffering any consequence for having done so. In the strategic communication environment of great power competition, perception frequently matters more than operational reality. China did not need to defeat the American Navy in the Strait of Hormuz to establish this point. It needed one tanker, one transit, and one press cycle. It has all three. Xi Jinping's diplomatic engagements this week are individually significant and collectively extraordinary. Let me take each one in turn before explaining what they construct together. The UAE meeting. Khaled bin Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan, the president of the United Arab Emirates, received Xi Jinping as the American blockade of the strait through which UAE energy exports must pass is active and generating economic disruption. The message that China is sending to Abu Dhabi in this meeting is specific and consequential. We see your vulnerability, we oppose the action creating it, and we are positioning ourselves as the relationship that protects your economic interests going forward. The UAE is not a hostile actor toward the United States. It hosts American military facilities. It has deep financial integration with the American-led global economic system. But it is also a country whose economic survival depends on unobstructed access to global energy markets through the Strait of Hormuz. When the country controlling that strait's obstruction is America and the country offering diplomatic opposition to that obstruction is China, the UAE's calculus about where its long-term security interests lie begins to shift at the margin. Margin shifts in Gulf state alignment have enormous consequences for the American strategic position in the region. The Spain visit, Pedro Sanchez traveling to Beijing to emphasize alignment on international law and encourage China to play a stronger role in a multipolar world order is a European NATO member essentially telling Beijing that Europe sees China as a legitimate counterweight to American unilateralism. This is not a break with NATO. It is not a strategic realignment, but it is a European government, a founding EU member, a NATO ally, publicly validating the Chinese position that the American blockade violates international law and that a multipolar order in which Chinese influence is welcomed is preferable to unipolar American dominance. The significance is institutional. Spain is not speaking only for Spain. It is speaking within a European conversation that is happening at every level, in Brussels, in Berlin, in Paris, about what the American withdrawal from the rules-based norms it claimed to champion means for European interests. China is inserting itself into that conversation as the defender of the very international legal principles that America is currently violating with the Hormuz blockade. That positioning has long-term consequences that extend far beyond this crisis. The Lavrov meeting. Russian coordination with China on the conflict and the maritime situation reflects the deepening of the strategic alignment we have discussed across multiple analyses. Russia and China are not formal allies in the treaty sense, but they are coordinating on the strategic management of a conflict that both view as an opportunity to demonstrate the limits of American power and to accelerate the transition to a multipolar order in which both have larger roles. Lavrov in Beijing discussing Hormuz with Chinese officials is the visible edge of a coordination that is far deeper and more operationally specific than what is being publicly acknowledged. Together, these three engagements span Gulf energy security, European institutional legitimacy, and Eurasian strategic weight. They are the three pillars of a coalition that is not being formally announced but is being actively constructed. A coalition defined not by a treaty but by a shared interest in demonstrating that American unilateral action in critical global commons can be challenged, resisted, and ultimately reversed. China's foreign ministry called the American blockade dangerous and irresponsible. Parse those two words with the care they deserve: dangerous. This is a legal and strategic claim. It asserts that the blockade creates conditions that threaten international peace and security, language that directly invokes the UN Charter framework under which the United States claims to operate. China is not just criticizing American policy. It is positioning American policy as a violation of the foundational principles of the international order, principles that China is now claiming to defend more faithfully than their author. Irresponsible. This is a reputational claim aimed at a specific audience. The global South, the non-aligned states, the countries that have spent decades being lectured by Washington about the importance of rules, norms, and responsible behavior in the international system. China is telling those governments that America is not a responsible steward of the global commons. That message, delivered from Beijing with the credibility of Chinese economic relationships that most of those governments depend on, lands differently than it would coming from any other source. The intended audience for this statement is not Washington. Washington is not going to change its blockade policy because Beijing called it irresponsible. The intended audience is every government between Washington and Beijing that has not yet decided which side of this confrontation it is on. China is making the case to that audience that the American side is the side of instability, illegality, and economic damage to developing world interests, and that the Chinese side is the side of international law, diplomatic resolution, and protected energy access. That case is not without merit, and its reception in capitals across Asia, Africa, and Latin America will shape the strategic landscape of this conflict for years after the immediate military confrontation is resolved. The energy economics of the Hormuz blockade deserve the detailed treatment they are not receiving in mainstream coverage because the economic damage pattern of this blockade is actively undermining the political coalition that American military operations require. The United States is not meaningfully dependent on Persian Gulf oil imports. American energy production has restructured American import dependency over the past 15 years to a degree that insulates the American economy from Gulf supply disruptions to an extent that no previous administration enjoyed. When Washington imposes a Hormuz blockade, the American economy does not immediately feel the consequences in ways that generate domestic political pressure against the blockade. The economies that immediately feel those consequences are India, Japan, South Korea, and the European states. These are American allies. These are the governments whose political support underwrites the legitimacy of American military operations. These are the countries whose populations begin to experience energy price shocks within weeks of sustained Hormuz disruption. Shocks that translate into inflation, transportation costs, manufacturing input costs, heating costs for ordinary citizens who have no strategic interest in the Iran conflict and no tolerance for bearing its economic burden. Political leaders in those countries are now managing a genuinely impossible situation. They cannot publicly break with Washington without consequences for their security relationships. But they cannot absorb sustained energy price shocks without consequences for their domestic political survival. The pressure those leaders are applying through private channels to Washington, pressure that will never appear in a press release, but that shapes every operational decision the American military makes in the Gulf, already significant and growing. China understands this pressure structure completely. China's diplomatic offensive is designed in part to give those governments, India, Japan, South Korea, the European states, political cover to push back against the blockade without formally breaking alliance relationships. When Spain's prime minister visits Beijing and endorses international law over American unilateralism, he is not just speaking for Spain. He is giving every other allied government a signal that public dissent from American policy carries legitimacy and European company. Now, let me take you to where this confrontation actually goes, because the U.S.-China dimension of the Hormuz crisis is no longer a peripheral complication of the Iran conflict. It is the central strategic story of the conflict's next phase. China has made itself a direct stakeholder. The star-rich passage, the diplomatic offensive, the foreign ministry declaration, the Lavrov coordination, these are not the actions of a country commenting on someone else's conflict. These are the actions of a country that has decided the outcome of the Hormuz confrontation is sufficiently important to Chinese strategic interests that it is willing to actively shape that outcome, to accept the American anger that active shaping produces, and to absorb whatever costs Washington imposes for Chinese non-compliance with the blockade. That decision that China has crossed from commentary to active stakeholder changes the strategic mathematics of the blockade entirely. American planners designing the blockade calculated the cost of Iranian resistance, the cost of Gulf state pressure, the cost of allied economic discomfort. It is not clear they adequately calculated the cost of China deciding to actively challenge blockade enforcement through the combination of diplomatic pressure, economic non-compliance, and strategic communication that Beijing is now deploying. 3 trajectories, all honest. Trajectory 1, the blockade holds but at accelerating costs. American naval forces maintain physical control of the strait. Chinese tankers that attempt transit face increasing enforcement pressure that Beijing must decide whether to escalate or absorb. The diplomatic cost of the blockade to American alliances accumulates. European political leaders face growing domestic pressure. Gulf states quietly communicate their discomfort through private channels. The blockade achieves its stated purpose of economic pressure on Iran, but at a cost to American strategic relationships that compounds with every week of continuation. China's diplomatic positioning solidifies. The post-crisis order looks significantly more multipolar than the pre-crisis order, and China claims credit for having defended international law, while America violated it. Trajectory 2. The blockade produces a direct U.S.-China naval incident. A Chinese vessel, naval escort, coast guard, or commercial with a sufficiently assertive transit attempt creates a confrontation in the strait that requires an American decision. Enforce the blockade against a Chinese vessel and risk a direct U.S.-China naval engagement, or yield and confirm publicly that the blockade does not apply to Chinese shipping. Neither option is acceptable. Both options are now on the table in ways they were not before the Star-Rich passage. A direct naval incident between American and Chinese forces in the Strait of Hormuz is the most dangerous single event that could occur in this conflict because it brings the world's 2 largest nuclear powers into direct kinetic contact over a geographical choke point that neither can afford to lose. Trajectory 3, economic pressure forces American policy modification negotiation before military escalation forces it. The energy price shocks hitting allied economies, amplified by Chinese diplomatic pressure, giving allied governments legitimacy to push back, produce a modification of American blockade enforcement. Not a formal end, not a public capitulation, but a quiet narrowing of what is actually being stopped that allows energy flows to partially resume while maintaining the political claim that the blockade is in force. China claims this as a victory for multilateral pressure. Washington claims the modified enforcement represents the policy as designed. The public fiction is maintained. The strategic reality that China successfully challenged American unilateral action in a critical global waterway is understood by every government watching, regardless of what either party says publicly. Here is what I need you to understand about what China has done this week. China did not fire a shot. China did not send a warship into confrontation with the United States Navy. China did not issue a military threat or a formal ultimatum. China sent a tanker, held 3 diplomatic meetings, and issued a press statement calling American policy irresponsible. And in doing so, China has potentially inflicted more damage on the American strategic position in the Middle East and in the broader global order than Iran has managed with its entire ballistic missile arsenal. Because China has revealed in a way that cannot be concealed or explained away that American power in the global commons has a limit. That the limit is enforced not by military resistance, but by economic interdependence, diplomatic legitimacy, and the simple reality that a blockade which cannot be applied to the world's second largest economy is not a blockade. It is a performance. The United States went into the Strait of Hormuz to project strength. What it has projected instead is the precise location of its constraint. And in the strategic competition of the 21st century, knowing where your adversary's constraint is located is worth more than almost any military capability. China now knows, and more importantly, the whole world now knows that China knows. This is the Jiang Report. I am Professor Jiang Xueqin. Subscribe immediately. Tor and the kites. Share this analysis now. Hit the notification bell. What is happening in the Strait of Hormuz is the most consequential great power confrontation since the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it is being covered as a shipping dispute. The people who need to understand what is actually at stake will only find this if you put it in front of them. We will be back when the next development breaks. The next 72 hours are critical. Stay close.